Get started. Welcome to our November 17th meeting. And we're fortunate tonight to have all of you and have our speaker here with us tonight, David Matuszak. David's going to raise your hand. We have other special guests, we're going to introduce David in a moment, with us tonight. And among them is our city manager, Mike Killebrew. And a masked man. And we have our new reporter for the Dana Point Times, Brianna Greenberg. Yay. Brianna, we're going to stand. Show us your face for a second. So she's with us and we're delighted to have her here. And I just have a few announcements. Last night in this room, a historic Woodruff home, 1929 date, was approved for not only, it had been approved for the Historic Resource Register, and it was approved for participation in the Mills Act, so we were thrilled about that. And in addition to that, the city has completed and installed 2 historic lanterns in the the Lantern Village Community Park is the title of the park. And we are going to have a ribbon cutting there on Thursday, December 9th. We'll gather between 3 and 3:30. Representatives from the city council members will be there around 4, and we hope the city manager and Matt Sinacori, who's really been instrumental in making it all happen. So that's December 9th. And in our January meeting, it will be our annual meeting, January 26th at the Community House. So those are the dates coming up, and we will be having a newsletter go out, our winter newsletter, shortly with all that information. So I am going to ask Keith Johannes to introduce his friend, David Matuszak, who's our speaker tonight.
Hello, welcome. I've known Dave Matuszak probably 40 years, I guess, something like that. We were both physical educators. He was, when I knew him, he was at Yucaipa and I was in Santa Ana. And his program was such a program that, working with staff development, we'd go visit him to see how he was conducting his program. And this is where I first came in touch with Dave as an author. He had written a book on physical education portfolios, and it was about how physical education students would not only keep track of what they did physically, but also keep track of what they were learning about how to get better physically and healthier. So appreciate him as an author in many different areas. He's done other books on the Western movies, and I think this is your 9th publication?
I think that's right.
So anyway, having known him for 40 years, I probably should quit now, otherwise it would be longer than his presentation. So I'd like you to introduce my friend, David Matuszak, a legend in the surfing world these days. So.
Thank you, and thank you for the invite, particularly to Keith. We did work for 40 years in a state organization, and Keith was our legislative analysis. He would follow the track bills going through the California legislature and find out how they were going to affect our subject area, and kept us apprised on a regular basis. He was our go-to guy. So we're going to talk about surfing culture today. I've got a little PowerPoint presentation I put together for you today. And I'll answer questions when we get to the end. We're going to kind of cover a wide variety of surfing culture, including a little bit about Dana Point and Doheny and so forth. So, as Keith explained, I wrote what now is commonly referred to as the Bible of Surfing. It's a 1,500-page coffee table anthology of the entire surfing experience from the beginning of time. And I mean going all the way back. We don't know exactly where surfing began. We have a pretty good idea it was in one of three places. And that was either in Africa, Polynesia, or Peru. We have evidence of surfing of some kind going on there, going in BC, in all three areas. And so I became involved in this project through a fella, an old surfing buddy of mine named Wally Dusler. We lost Wally about 3 years ago, about 6 weeks shy of his 100th birthday. I surfed and played beach volleyball with him for about 40 years. And at some point in his early 90s, as he was telling me stories of San Onofre in the early days, and he began surfing at San Onofre in 1937. And I said, Wally, I said, somebody else has got to hear these stories. I said, we need to chronicle this. Let's put together a little 50-page booklet, and we'll call it Wally's Memories of San Onofre. Well, before we even got started on the project, a couple months later, Wally had spread the news to some of his contemporaries that were all in their late 80s and early 90s at the time. This is about 10 years ago. And one by one, they said, well, we have memories too. We want in on this. And one at a time, they invited me to their homes. I did digital oral histories on each one of them. They opened up their family photo albums, and I scanned hundreds of photographs of the earliest days of California surfing, going all the way back to the 1930s. And I was very fortunate to do this when I did, because all but one of these surfers are past now. As I said, I met them 10 years ago, most of them right at 90 or better. So the process that I undertook on this project, being an academic, was to try to dispel many of the myths about surfing. So much of surfing had been folklore and myth, and there really had been very little academic study in the area of surfing. Maybe one of the biggest myths that I dispelled was, how many of you are familiar with the old, what we know now as a wives' tale, that the missionaries did away with surfing in the late 1800s in Hawaii? Anybody heard that story? Yeah. That's common in the surfing world. Well, there's no basis to that. And in fact, I went and read some of the old missionaries' diaries and letters and found out in many cases they were actually supportive of surfing. And I've actually documented instead that they ended, surfing almost disappeared in the late 1800s, but it was for economical reasons, not because the missionaries thought that it was an immoral sport. You have to remember, surfing in those days was done naked. And the men and women both surfed naked, and sometimes surfing was often, in fact, foreplay between the men and the women. So part of that the missionaries didn't take on too well. So I interviewed dozens, and in fact I have 200 contributors to this book. How many of you know the Bainies right up here at the street, Infinity Surfboards? Steve and Barry Bainey are world champion tandem surfers. I've known them since the early 80s. We raised kids together on the beach, and they are two of my primary contributors. How many of you know Fly? Okay, for those of you who don't know Fly, that's his surfing nickname. His real name is some long French name that I'm not even going to begin. That's it. He said it very well. And so he actually got the nickname Fly. He tells the story for the book that he was jumping off some waterfall rock in Hawaii at some point, and his buddies said, boy, you were flying down that jump, and that's where he got the name. He's one of the old classic surfboard shapers, and he's still shaping boards. And he has a shop not too far, a little industrial center, not too far from the Costco over here. I think that's right on the edge of Dana Point, I think, isn't it? It's in Beach. Capo Beach, technically?
Yeah, isn't it?
I think it is, because you go by the Capo Beach post office. Exactly. He actually, right in the old industrial center right out behind the post office there is where his shop is. Fantastic guy. He was one of the shapers for the early surfboard makers, guys like Whitey and some of these old classics. And as I said, he's still shaping today, and he's really a neat guy. Go by and introduce yourself. He'll visit with you. We've talked about the Pioneer family photo albums. I started surfing at San Onofre in 1980. I was a latecomer. This is my 50th anniversary of surfing. It's also my 50th anniversary of high school. In fact, a young lady back here in the corner is one of my old classmates, Michelle. We attended our 50th high school reunion Saturday night and reconnected. So in the days that I began surfing in '71 in Huntington Beach, San Onofre had just opened actually in '71 to the public. Prior to that, it had been a private club. They call it the most exclusive surf club in the world. 5-year waiting list. You couldn't even go on the beach without an official membership card. Movie stars were being turned down, had to wait in line for 5 years to be able to surf there. And for those of you, let's back up a little bit. For those of you who don't know exactly where San Onofre is, it's where the present day Camp Pendleton is. In 1971, they opened it up to the public on a 50-year lease with the Department of the Navy. Department of the Navy is the one who basically owns the place and operates it as the Marine base that we know. And then, with an academic background, I did an exhaustive search of the literature. So that gives you some idea of the process. So no other surfing beach in the world better demonstrates the class, ethnic, and subculture diversity of the times than San Onofre. Placing surfing culture into the context of the subcultures that encountered pioneer surfers helps to better understand surfing's place in California history and culture. No other place in the world has this unique or had this unique mixture of subcultures. San Onofre began with Native Americans, the Ashiman, which I'm sure you guys are familiar with because they were renamed by the Spanish the Juaneños after Mission San Juan Capistrano right next door. And so I actually start the book there and talk about the early Native Americans. And I spent several years actually determining which of the Native American tribes along our coastal communities, from the Chumash in the Santa Barbara area all the way down to the Sandigueñans, where Mission San Diego was. And for those of, are you all familiar with the Spanish, how they renamed all the tribes with the Spanish missions? If you're not, basically what happened was when the colonists came in, the missionaries changed the Native American tribe name to match a name that coincided with the mission that served them, or that they served the mission. And so we have the Juaneños for Mission San Juan Capistrano, the Luiseños for Mission San Luis Rey, the Tongva from Mission San Gabriel were renamed to the Gabrielanos, and so forth and so on. I spent a lot of time trying to determine which one of these tribes may have been surfers. We have one old record of a Spanish ship off the coast of Malibu that recorded the Chumash surfing the waves at Malibu, and this is back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, with their tamals, their dugout canoes. And we know that the Chumash were, as you probably know with your history here, were avid tradesmen, and that they traveled at least as far south as San Juan Capistrano to the mission here to trade and barter. So there's a whole section in the book about the Native Americans as well. After the Native Americans, of course, we had the Spanish with the Portola expedition. Interestingly enough, I traced the route that Portola took on the expedition the first land crossing in California in the late 1700s. And as you probably know, they dropped off Father Serra in San Diego, where he established the first mission, and then they marched on. They had their sights set on a wood cross in Monterey Bay, where a Spanish sailor had posted a wooden cross on the bay. They never found it. In fact, they never found Monterey Bay. They overshot it, and they think they were in San Francisco Bay. And but that kind of, they were, spotting future locations for missions and so forth. So the significance of the Spanish, of course, is they named San Onofre after Saint Onofrius. And that whole story is in the book as well. San Onofre became a Spanish cattle ranch, Rancho San Onofre. In my book, there's actually a rather significant chapter on surfing cowboys. Not only do I start with the beginning of cowboys gathering cattle there in San Onofre Canyon when the first surfers in the 30s and 40s were still there, but the entire surfing culture developed around surfing cowboys. How many of you, I should ask this right off the bat, how many of you have ever surfed? Okay, we've got, good. Okay, we've got a handful. How many of you know the name Dale Velzy? Okay. Dale Velzy was a founding member of the Surfing Cowboys. It was a group founded by my old saddle maker, actually, and an artist friend of mine. It was a group, 8 guys, old cowboys, were hanging out at a Vaquero Ranch roping competition down in Descanso that was hosted by my old saddle maker. And they were all drinking a bottle of tequila on a Saturday night and discovered that they had all been 60 surfers. And they started the Longboard Cowboys right there on the spot, and I became a member about 10 years later. And so Keith Malloy, a famous big wave surfer that just retired a few years ago, he spends more time in the branding pen now than he does on a surfboard. I also found a kind of an interesting connection to the legendary good behavior that San Onofre is famous for. The old golden age of surfing behavior amongst surfers. There's a connection between the Western movie industry that I discovered by accident when I was interviewing these old pioneer surfers. And I discovered they were all watching Westerns. And they'd all grown up on Westerns in the 30s and 40s. And so I began to pose the question to them, the good behavior that San Onofre is famous for, that you guys and gals started, did it have anything to do with the code of the West that you grew up on, watching the Saturday matinees for a nickel with Gene Autry and later Roy Rogers in the 50s and all the 50s Westerns that was part of our culture during the beginnings, the origins of the golden age of surfing? And they all scratch their heads and they go, we never thought about it, but you're absolutely right. That's where we learned good guys and the bad guys and how to conduct ourselves. So if you were here a little earlier, there was an older gentleman and his wife that came over to pick up a book from me. The fellow's name was Bob Haven. He's the surviving son of Norm Haven. How many of you have heard of Norm? He passed just this last year during COVID. Norm and his family farmed the Haven farm at San Onofre, the legendary farm. In fact, Norm's father started the farm there in 1926, moved down from the Anaheim, Santa Ana area where he became world famous in the 20s for producing tomato seeds, of all things. He had invented this process to separate seeds out of the pulp. And they started this huge farming production at San Onofre that was there for decades. And Norm was a wealth of information. Some of the photographs that we'll see tonight came from his collection. The first surfers in this part of Southern California congregated primarily at Corona del Mar, before the jetty. And as the legend goes, how many of you are familiar with the name Whitey Harrison? Lauren Whitey Harrison, okay? He was a local product, lived in the Hyde House, we'll talk about in a minute. Whitey, as the story goes, came up the coast from Baja on a surfing safari, drove by San Onofre, must have been Trestles where the old highway PCH was, and saw really nice waves breaking. And he drove up to Corona del Mar, and that's like 40 miles. And remember, this was the old Highway 1. Pulled up and said, hey, we just saw some great waves down at San Onofre, let's go check it out. So they took 2 carloads of surfers down, including a woman named Marianne Hawkins, one of the pioneer woman surfers. And they went down, and that was in 1933, and it's the first documented case of surfing in San Onofre. Now, I do make an argument that George Freeth, the kind of the father of modern surfing here in the United States, he came from Hawaii in the early 1900s. He was traveling the surfliner route down to San Diego. And it's very possible that he saw those same waves that Whitey Harrison had seen in the car. How many of you are familiar with the term flag stop on a train? Okay? So in the old days, if you wanted to stop a train and there wasn't a train station, you pulled out your bandana or a hanky or whatever you had, or a cloth t-shirt, and you'd flag the train down. And the train would stop, pick you up, let you off later on the way back. This was before they built the train station at San Onofre. So I make an argument that it's very possible that he could have flag stopped and stopped at San Onofre and surfed. I did find a lawyer in Riverside who flag stopped the train on the surfliner as late as the early 1970s and stopped in San Clemente to surf. His teenage buddies were able to flag stop the train there. And so it could have been done. Very possible. San Onofre Surfing Club, undoubtedly the most famous surfing club in the world. As I indicated to you before, it was an exclusive club. It started in 1952. It was formed because the Marines said, your behavior is out of control. If you don't, and they'd had special permission, a small group of them, to go down on the base to surf, just in one location, what we now call Old Man's, the Old Man's Break. The Marines just said, if you don't put a lid on this, you're going to lose your privileges. So they started in 1952, they started the San Onofre Surfing Club, and it became this private club, and they were able to organize it, make sure that people were behaving themselves. And this is probably a good time to bring up the fact that in the early days in the 30s and 40s, particularly before World War II, it was a wild singles scene. They were all in their late teens, early 20s, heavy drinkers, heavy partying, etc., etc. Most of the surfers went away to World War II. When they came back, they started to raise families, and San Onofre transitions from a wild singles beach to a legendary family beach that it is still to this day. So the journey down to San Onofre, the first book I wrote came from my doctoral dissertation about the California Gold Rush. And as you remember from your 4th grade history, there were 3 routes to the gold rush: around the Horn, across the Isthmus of Panama, and overland. And I borrowed a little bit of the format for that first book that I wrote, which was a study of the entire gold rush experience as seen through the eyes of the miners of one particular gold camp called Nelson Creek. And that's essentially the format that I've used here. It's a look at the entire surfing culture, looking basically through the eyes of the pioneer surfers at San Onofre, and then all the way up to our modern times. So I got to thinking, wouldn't it be kind of interesting to trace the routes that surfers took to San Onofre in the 30s and 40s before the interstate system? And so there's a whole chapter on that, and it talks about, in picture form as well, shows what a surfer in the 30s and 40s would have seen on their way to San Onofre, which included, of course, driving right through what we now call Dana Point. This is an aerial shot, by the way, from the Haven collection. There's two buildings there. The white building in the center with the flag on the top was a famous San Onofre cafe. It was there for decades, and the surfers used to go have breakfast there and lunch and hang out. Norm Haven actually later became a linoleum layer, flooring specialist, one of the many jobs that he did. And he drew me a specific map. He said he resurfaced the floor on that 3 times. He knew the floor plan exactly. And so in the book, I have a hand-drawn map from him of exactly where the counters were, where the jukebox was. And of course, I'd get all these stories that I heard of people going in lunch, and they had pictures of surfers on the walls. A fellow named Jim Irwin, who wrote one of the forewords to my book, actually obtained 2 of the original photographs that were taken in the 30s and 40s that were hanging on the wall. And when they demolished the cafe to build Interstate 5, he acquired 2 of those photographs, which are pretty classic. The other building on the left was a Texaco station. That was a famous Texaco station. And how many of you are familiar with the name Bruce Myers? Anybody ever own a dune buggy? He was the inventor of the dune buggy, the Myers Manx dune buggy. He was an old San Onofre surfer, and he tells a wonderful story. We just lost him this last year, during this last COVID year. He was 95 when he passed, and he was still going down to San Onofre. He was part of our musical group called the Bamboo Room, where the surfers get together and they play old traditional songs and so forth, and Hawaiian songs and pop songs from the old golden age of surfing. And he told a wonderful story as a teenager back in the 40s of climbing up the ladder on the back of that gas station late on a Saturday after the gas station closed, and his buddies would go up there and spend the night and then get up early in the morning and go back down to San Onofre to surf. It's just part of our folklore. This look familiar? Should. Killer Dana? What would become Dana Point? So this is what a surfer in the 30s would have driven through. A lot of ranch land, wasn't there? A lot of cattle still grazing on these hills back then. And then off to the left there, I guess about mid-picture there would be, well, off to the left here would be kind of Doheny State Beach, because pretty much everything in the bay there, you guys are the experts on this, would be where the harbor is today, right? Yeah. This one should look familiar. It probably is the most, other than the Mission, the most famous building in this area. This is where, for those of you who don't know what the Hide House was, during the days of hides and tallow, during the Mission cattle herds, there was no Mission, let me back step. Before the gold rush, there was no market for beef in California. But there was something to trade with the trade ships, and that was hides and tallow from the cattle. And each one of the missions had 5, 10, 20,000 head of cattle. That was their primary source of income for trade. And they would literally slaughter the cattle out and lay the carcasses out on the fields. That's why the grizzly bear population skyrocketed during those years. Now, when the California gold rush arrived, all of a sudden there was a market for beef. Rancho San Onofre was one of 3 ranchos down there. Rancho San Onofre, Rancho Las Flores, and Rancho Santa Margarita. Eventually they all were absorbed into the Rancho Santa Margarita. And Santa Margarita, after the gold rush began, ended up being the largest beef producer in California. They were driving cattle from San Diego County all the way to the gold fields in Northern California. Now, you know it as the Hide House, but did you know it as the Board House? Because when Whitey lived there and his family, we'll go back to the Fly that I mentioned earlier. The Fly married one of Whitey's daughters. And and he lived, if I remember, Fly said he lived across the street from the Hide House when he was married there. And there was a barn out here someplace. Maybe you guys know exactly. Is it still there?
Yes.
The barn's still there? Well, that's where they shaped the boards. And I had numerous reports of guys that pulled in there, and Whitey or the Fly were shaping boards, and they would come in and help and watch. And one of my buddies, Stan Ford, tells a story of how the Fly had printed phony passes onto trestles somehow. I can't remember the details of the story, but he was handing them out to his buddies, and they were a free ticket to get into to surf there at San Onofre. But that's all part of the folklore that goes along with the Hide House. And so, again, for those of you who aren't familiar with that building, that aren't from Dana Point, the Hide House is an old adobe where they stored the hides during the days of the hide trade. This is kind of a fun story. Whitey Harrison was a prolific surfer, what we call a waterman today. Or back then, I should say. We don't use the term too often today. A waterman in those days was somebody who could do anything on the ocean. They were fishermen, they were divers, they were sailors, they were surfers, canoe riders, anything you could do in the ocean they could do. They were prolific watermen. So, some friends of mine, the gal in the front there is Alice Landis, sitting on the upper left-hand corner. And then her husband, Hal Landis, which were two of the pioneers that I befriended and interviewed, a fellow named Bob Fitzgerald, and Whitey. One day there's no waves at San Onofre, so they decide they're going to hike up the creek, and there was a downed sycamore tree. And they thought this would make a pretty good outrigger. So they started carving. And when I went to the Landis house in Long Beach to hear the second version of the story, Hal is saying we were up San Mateo Creek. And Allie, Alice's wife, said, no, that was up San Onofre Creek. And he says, how do you know? He says, don't you remember? I painted the barn. And then we walked over to the house, and hanging on the wall is a picture of the barn that while the guys were carving the canoe, she was painting the barn on the Haven farm that I mentioned earlier. And so they went up there, and this dugout became something of a story because the picture on the right-hand side is from the Simmental family collection. I met Diane Simmental through Norm Haven, if I remember correctly. As a girl, she grew up on the farm. The man on the right was Diane's father. The boy on the left was Diane's little brother, and Diane was taking the picture. This would have been about 1947. Diane's grandmother had given her a Brownie box camera, and she took some 400 photographs with that camera. And the collection is unbelievable. And we'll talk a little bit more about it in a little bit. But she found the same dugout canoe right next to her farmhouse. So at some point they had dragged it up from the creek to the farmhouse, and then it stayed there for a while. This is over a 2-year period this thing was being carved out. Whenever there weren't waves, they'd go, carve the canoe. Some point, I'm not sure exactly where this is, but that's Whitey there with his trademark hat on the lower left-hand corner. And that's Mary Ann, his daughter, who I interviewed and got this photograph from. And that must be her little brother. I'm trying to remember exactly who the boy was. The finished product ends up on the beach at San Onofre, and that's in the lower right-hand corner. And that's what the dugout ended up 2 years later. That was in front of or next to one of the earliest of the San Onofre shacks. Later, this place became Old Man's. It wasn't called that originally. They named it that later, not because the waves are Old Man caliber, as most people think today. It's because those young teenage party singles that were there in the 30s and 40s, by the time they got into the 50s and 60s, they were old men. And they were still hanging out there. And then that's where we got the Old Man's. The car culture at San Onofre is particularly unique. It's the one place that I know of, and I have surfed now in the last 11 months. I've done all 4 coasts. I did an entire surfing safari on the West Coast, from San Diego all the way to the Columbia River. May and June of this year, I did the Gulf Coast and East Coast all the way up to Maine. And on the way home, the morning after a tornado, I surfed Lake Michigan, 2 to 4 foot waves. And I've now surfed what I call the North Coast. There are surfing cultures in all 4 of these coasts, but only one place that I've ever been to has the car culture that San Onofre is famous for. In other words, you pull up right on the beach, park at the log, and you put your beach chair out on the sand right in front of your car, and you are known as much for your surfboard as you are for your car. If you're looking for somebody, you know where they park, you know what they drive, and it's your personal landmark is what it is. So there's an extensive chapter in the book about all the things that surfers drove to the beach, going all the way back to the days of Joe Quigg. That's Joe Quigg in the upper left-hand corner, a very famous surfboard maker. I think he just passed in the last few months. If I remember, I think I saw his obituary just in the last 3 or 4 months. But that's him there at San Onofre in what looks like what, a Model T probably? Maybe a Model A. Model A, huh? Yeah. Lower left-hand corner is the Gary and Janin Clark, world famous for their woodies. They have the woody, actually they are the ones that host the Doheny Woody Fest that was just a few weeks ago right here at the state park. And so the 2 iconic surf vehicles, as you probably know, are first the Woody and then the VW bus. And everything else we've driven to the beach is there as well. Landmarks, you know, we're the last generation that navigated by landmarks. It's all GPS now. So when I try to explain younger generations that, you know, before you had your cell phone and your GPS, we just had to go from one landmark to another. If we had to find some place, we looked for a land feature. In surfing's case, we looked for trestles, the train trestles. There's 2 of them at San Onofre. This is the one that looks like at San Onofre Creek. It's hard to tell. But there are 2 of them there. Church. How many of you have heard of the famous surfing break called Church? Okay. You ever seen a picture of the church that they named it after? Nobody had. I spent 2 years. It became my holy grail. I literally spent 2 years finding an image. I had so many conflicting reports of what that church looked like by the old timers that drove right by it to get to San Onofre and then later surfed in front of it. In the early days, they didn't surf Church or the Point or Trestles. They all were surfing down in what we call Old Man's now. But later, by the late 40s, 50s, they were surfing at Church, and they were lining up with this landmark church. Nobody knew where it was. Nobody knew what it looked like. We had a general idea. So I spent some time with the base archaeologist at Camp Pendleton. He didn't have a clue where it was. Well, I was looking in a completely wrong area because somebody put a PVC cross up on the beach there at Church, and I'm thinking that must have been where it was. I had a false report that there was a foundation near the freeway overpass that I got from an archivist at the Sherman Library and Gardens, and that turned out to be wrong. Well, I found a painting at the Sherman Library, which led later to Diane Simitol. She went to church there with her Brownie box camera. Hundreds of photographs of the church, inside and out, first communions, baptisms, fiestas, and then, how many of you have heard of the surfing padre? He passed about 2 or 3 years ago at the age of 92. Anybody know that name? Surfing Padre was a world-famous figure. He was a priest out of one of the churches in Huntington Beach. And he was famous for doing the blessing of the waves ceremony before the U.S. Open, arguably the biggest surfing contest in the world. And I got to be friends with him the year before he died. I had a whole box full of these photographs, and I went down to him and I said, "Father, I was raised in the Catholic Church. I understand the sacred oath that you took about confession. So I'm going to begin our little meeting by saying, bless me, Father, for I have sinned. This is my confession, and now you can't sit under the penalty of eternal damnation. You cannot divulge any of these photographs until this book goes out on the market, because I want to be the first ones to have the pictures of the church." And he kind of chuckled and he says, "Deal." Unfortunately, he passed before the book came out. Fortunately for me, as a seminary student, he was stationed at the chapel at San Onofre. And he was able to identify for my photo captions most of the people in my photographs. And it was just really lucky that I got to him when I did. So, yeah. So, not even Steve Pesman from the Surfers Journal had ever seen an image of the church. So they were all kind of interested because they all knew it. They'd all surfed it before. That's what it looked like. Opening day, 1943, Easter. It was a corrugated steel auto shop building of some sort on Camp Pendleton. The then base commander's mother had recently passed, and he made arrangements to have the chapel converted. The auto repair place converted to a chapel and named in his mother's memory. His mother was a Catholic. And it turned out, for a long time I didn't even know what denomination it was. I ended up tracing down the church records. All of the Catholic church records in California are housed at the Mission Santa Barbara. If you're ever looking for church records, that's the archives. And I ended up going up there, spending a couple of days with the archivist up there. And he had a little file on it and a couple of photographs. What he had was the church ledgers. So in my book, I can even tell you how much money they were taking in on the basket on Sundays. So yeah, it's pretty fun stuff. The church morphed a little bit. Later they put a little steeple on the top and a cross and all that sort of thing. But that's what it looked like. So how many of you are familiar with Forster City? Forster City, okay? Forster was a fellow right around in the late 1800s that started an actual community right there at San Onofre. And he had a plan. I have the plot plan. Are you familiar with the term strand? Beach communities, the strand, that term that they use. So in the early 1900s, the first strand started appearing in the Redondo Beach and Santa Monica area. Wealthy landowners were trying to attract people from Los Angeles to come out and buy lots along the coast. And to lure them, he hired a fellow named George Freeth, the father of modern surfing, who would come over from Hawaii to put on surfing demonstrations. And so these strand developments were fairly common back around the early 1900s. So Forster actually had a plot plan. I have an image of it in the book. A plot plan. It would have been up on the bluffs where, basically where the power plant is today. And he had this all subdivided out. It never materialized. And Forster died and the buildings deteriorated. I found some records that 2 of the buildings had been moved, had been dismantled, put on flatbed cars, and trained up here to Dana Point and San Juan Capistrano. This is one of them. So this was the Combs house. The other building, in fact, that was my first contact. This was about 10 years ago. I contacted somebody in your organization. I said, do you know this building? Is it still standing here in Dana Point? And nobody knew anything about it. I did later find this image. Now, when I took this picture about 6-7 years ago, this was the Hummingbird Cafe. Is it still there? It's a little coffee shop. Okay, so that was the old Combs building. It came from Forster City down there at San Onofre. So we talked about the transition from a singles party to a family beach. This is the Jim Irwin family here, about 1975. Jim was a legendary surfer at San Onofre. He started surfing there in the 40s, right after the war. He announced the surfing contests at San Onofre for about 50 years. We just lost him again this year. We've lost a lot of them this year. He died at 95 this past year. Talked a little bit about the connection to the Western influence. Anybody surf San Onofre at all? Do you know the name Don Craig? Don's about, I guess, Don's early 70s. I think he's like 71, 72. His father was one of the earliest club presidents of the San Onofre surfing contest, so Don was raised on the beach. And during my interviews with him, I'm going through his family photograph. This is Don and his brother on the right there. And this was part of the cowboy culture in the 50s that we grew up on. And on the left is a fellow named Brown. He built the very first windmill, surfboard windmill at the Old Man Shack at San Onofre. He passed, I attended his paddle out about 5 years ago. So as you study artifacts of all the famous things that happened in Dana Point as a historical society, you got to start thinking, at some point, when are they going to start collecting surfing memorabilia? Because the culture of surfing is going to be studied 1,000 years from now. And they're going to be studying the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, primarily. The early days of surfing. And so I have a sizable chapter in the book about stuff. It's all the stuff that we surfers take to the beach, everything. From surfboards to surf wax, and it's the origins of surf wax, the origins of a leash, the surf leash, beach chairs, towels, coolers, all the stuff you pack in the back of your SUV or whatever you're taking to the beach today. And it's part of our history and part of our culture. One of the unique aspects of San Onofre is its primitive nature, and the San Onofre Surfing Club is primarily responsible for keeping San Onofre natural. The surf club saw what happened to Doheny. They didn't like what they saw. They didn't like the blacktop. They didn't like the grass, the ornamental bushes. They didn't like the commercialism of having a cafe and all that sort of thing there. They wanted the place to stay primitive, with no vendors, nothing. And the surf club has been very influential in keeping it that way. It's still a dirt road to get down there. San Onofre, in this picture in 1939 roughly, it looks the same way. The bluffs look a little different because in the 70s they came in and bulldozed and leveled the whole top of the bluff off when they were building the power plant and filled in a lot of these ravines. But since the 1970s, erosion is beginning to make it look like it did back in these days here. So yeah, it's all about keeping it natural. Surfing culture, as we talked a little bit about, has influenced California, American, and world culture tremendously. Clothing styles, speech. I was surfing at San Onofre today, and for the last couple hours I was there was a young guy, he must be 20 years old, and I think every fourth word out of his mouth was dude. Dude, hey dude, this is great dude. And I wanted to tell him, I said, you know what? are you talking to a cowboy or you're talking to a surfer when you say dude? Because it's, you know, it's two different. Do you know where that word dude came from? I actually have traced the origins of surf music, the origins of surf art, surf literature, and surf films are all studied and expanded upon in the book. Gidget, how many of you remember the movie? Okay, that kind of launched the whole sport. There have been two booms in surfing. One was in 1959 with the release of the Gidget movie. It was preceded by the novel. And then later on they had the television series and a whole series of beach movies that came about after that. But it all started with Gidget, and that's what exploded what I call the golden age of surfing in the 60s. The second boom in surfing has been the last year and a half, COVID. COVID has exploded our sport. When I used to see surfing breaks up and down the coast, that I would see 30 to 50 surfers in the water just 2 years ago, now have 200 surfers in the water. And most of them are on the Costco Wavestorm soft top boards. They're the foam board that you can buy for $99. They're all new surfers to the sport. It's an introductory level surfboard. And all up and down the coast, it's like that. In fact, all four coasts, it's like that. I have a very, very significant chapter on women in surfing in the book. Most notably, well, let's start with number one. In the early days of surfing, and talking the 30s and 40s, I would say less than 10% of all the surfers were women. And I always posed the question to each of the pioneer surfers that I interviewed: how were you treated in the water? How were you accepted by the men? And I got a wide range of responses. And that's very much like it was in California. As you are all historians, being members of the society here, you know that in the early 1850s, about 10% of the women of the population in California were women, and the vast majority of those were working women at night. So women now are, I would say today, when I was in the water, there were probably 100 surfers, maybe 20 of them were women. So they've come a long ways. I found the most remarkable document that I was able to dig up in an archive was a scrapbook from 1938 from what I've now documented as the first women's surfing club in the world. It was at San Onofre. They called themselves the San Onofre Wahines. In fact, I just happened to notice that somebody had a picture of an article that the Orange County Register, and there's a picture of, these are the founding members of the Wahines here, and this is a picture of them from my book. These are both pictures from my book, with their little sweatshirt that said the Wahines at San Onofre. 18, 19, 20-year-olds, most of them were going to school at USC, looked like very affluent families they came from. And wild times, heavy drinkers, heavy partiers. The club lasted 2 years. It disappeared. We don't know why. The scrapbook ends abruptly with no explanation of why. I don't even know who made the scrapbook. I've speculated just by the process of elimination who it might have been. But what I think happened based on the scrapbook contents, I think they were getting pregnant, they were eloping, getting married, starting to raise families, and I think that's what happened. It was before the pill. And I really believe that that's why the club disappeared so abruptly. African American surfers, I've got the origins of African American surfing. Still to this day, very, very few African Americans surf. It's largely because it's a culture of non-swimmers, and it's not because of physiology, it's because of culture. And I trace this. One of the places we think surfing began was in Africa. And when the slave traders came along, they drove the tribes inland away from the ocean. And this prolific swimming culture that they had in early Africa disappeared. And then, to further that, the slave traders and the slave owners discouraged the slaves from swimming because, first of all, they didn't want them jumping ship and swimming to shore when they were leaving Africa. When they got to the south, they had public drownings as punishment for people who were trying to escape, to try and instill a fear of the water against African Americans who might want to go through the bayou and try and escape the plantation. And then it went one step further in the early 1900s when America was learning to swim. You might remember the story of the fellow who was teaching through the YMCA swimming lessons all over the country. Well, in the early 1900s, it was white-only swimming pools and white-only swim clubs. And so to this day, the latest statistics, depending on which study you look at, and largely depending on the age group, between 25 and 50% of all African Americans can swim. It's no wonder we don't see a lot of African Americans in the water. If you can't swim, it can be a terrifying experience to be in turbulent waters. All forms of surfing I've touched on in some way. Raise your hand if you've ever body surfed. Yeah, that's most of us start that way. Outrigger canoe surfing, no, that's pretty rare. Prone surfing means laying on your belly like on a boogie board. Okay. We just lost another icon, as you know. Tom Morey passed just a few weeks ago. Stand-up surfing, tandem surfing, where you hold a partner up and they do kind of a gymnastics type poses. Kneeboarding, skimboarding. How many have tried skimboarding? That was a fun deal, especially back in the 60s and 70s. And Laguna is the world capital of that now. It's gone way past what we used to do in the 70s. Foil surfing is the big thing now, where they've got this big foil coming off the back and they literally ride the current of the wave, and they can actually ride out. They ride the currents going out and they turn around, they don't even have to paddle out. It's really kind of an interesting deal. And then other forms of surfing as well. Adapted surfing for paraplegics, mostly paraplegics, not too many quads are surfing. The fellow on the left is an old friend of mine, Greg Bond. He's one of the pioneers in adapted surfing. He lost his leg from about the knee down. He got a cut. He was a professional surfer, and he got a cut that got infected, and he was in Indonesia, had some bad surgery in unsterile conditions, and developed an infection. And so he's one of the modern innovators. And the other one is right up the street here, is Steve Bainey. He's they surf on what they call wave skis, and they sit down on them, as you can see. Wounded warrior surfing, I've got a whole section on that. Camp Pendleton, I actually found that Camp Pendleton had a surfing team in the 60s. I have a photograph of the surfing team from Camp Pendleton. They surfed against other military bases. The religion and ethos of surfing, I looked at great depth. Keith, I don't know if you found this section of the book when you got your book before. I think you'll enjoy the play versus sport section. And this is a concept that physical educators have talked about and philosophized about for decades. Is, where do you draw the line between play and competition in sport? And I've written a nice section drawing on our backgrounds in that area. I think you'd have some fun looking at that area. Environmental concerns, as you know, up and down the coast, we're losing coastline. It's a serious problem. We almost lost San Onofre Beach about 3 years ago when this area, right as you come down off the pay station, you come down to the dirt road, and right along where you see the cracked area there on the berm, the waves were threatening to wash out that road there. And they had to get Coastal Commission permission to put big rock boulders in there to shore up that, and the Surfrider Foundation fought them. They didn't want the rocks to go in. Surfrider Foundation, a once very, very good organization, kind of has morphed into an extreme environmental group that's in management right now. I have a full story on that whole part of it. They ended up getting a temporary permit to put the rock seawall in to shore it up, and the Surfrider Foundation is fighting to have it taken out. And it's kind of a long story, and I talk about it in the book, and it's very misguided. To show you how much shoreline we've lost at San Onofre alone, the picture on the left there, these are the traditional size volleyball courts that are 30 feet wide and 60 feet deep. So you see 3 courts there. Each one is 30 feet wide. There's about 10 feet in between each court. And then you see the 3 courts going out. You see another 40 feet of sand to the edge of the bluff. Then you probably had another 30 or 40 feet to the water line. If you go to the same spot today, you see where the first court is next to the motorhomes? That's it. The bluff begins at the end of the first court. We've lost 75 feet of coastline in 40 years and 30 feet in the last 5 or 6 years. It's been a very, very significant problem at San Onofre. Yeah. This should look a little familiar. The famous Killer Dana, generally recognized as one of the great surfing breaks in America, that was totally destroyed when they put the breakwater in and built the harbor. And yeah, unfortunately, I had not begun surfing quite yet. I think, when did they start you guys would know. What year? 70? Is when?
66 was 66 was the last.
Yeah, I think it was in the 60s is when
The
they.
end of surfing was in 66.
Right, because I started surfing in 71 and it was gone. Doheny was already there when I was surfing.
August of 66.
Yeah, it's a shame. So this was the process. The date's probably on. I don't think I have the date on. This is from the Orange County Archives. So Canoe Drummond is somebody that I highlight in my book, in the canoe outrigger section. And I found this photograph actually recently on an online search. And he's in the center there. He was the main activist trying to fight off the breakwater. And this was, he brought a bunch of surfers down. He surfed on a canoe, and he was world famous for doing that. And he surfed big waves. I mean, big 20, 30-foot waves in a canoe. So he was a legendary waterman of his day. And there is what I suspect, now I can't tell you for certain, but I suspect this was Killer Dana. This was the hurricane of 39. There have been 2 great hurricanes in this century, 39 and 15, just 5-6 years ago. So in 1939, that's when all of Southern California flooded. It was before they put the flood systems in. If you go back and look at the photographs, the Los Angeles River jumping its banks and flooding out Los Angeles, the Santa Ana River jumping its banks and flooding out Santa Ana, and water up to the top of people's homes and so forth. This was the great 39 hurricane, and the old timers talked about it. When I interviewed Gwen Waters, who is the widow of the famous Johnny Waters, maybe the greatest watermen of them all. These were people from that old Corona del Mar group of surfers that made the transition to San Onofre. Peanuts Larson was one of those people. And Gwen told me the story, and I just found this photograph recently. This is an old Doc Ball photograph. And Gwen told me the story of that Peanuts had related to her. When he surfed this hurricane, and it very well would have been this wave, because you don't get too many tries in a hurricane. Now remember, this guy is probably 5'10", 6 foot. That surfboard he's surfing is probably 10 to 11 feet long. And if you measure on body height, you're looking at about a 25 to 30 foot wave right here at Doheny. And so he told the story to Gwen that, and I'm paraphrasing, it was something to the effect that when he came out of the tunnel, and he was referring to a tube, of course, when he came out of the tunnel, I had the lantern lit on my helmet like a miner to find my way out of the tunnel. And he said it more eloquently than I'm relating the story today. But that's a wave. So 2015, remember Hurricane Maria, 25 to 30 foot waves right here in Southern California. And I've got a picture at church that was given to me by John DeMurth, I think is how he pronounces his last name. He's a local guy. He runs a little boat restoration business right over there in that industrial center over there near the Fly Surf Shop. He had a buddy take a picture of him at the top of what I would think would, judging from the perspective, is probably an 18 to 20 foot wave at church during Hurricane Maria. Yeah. It's time for your questions. Anybody have any questions about any aspect that we've talked about or anything else surfing?
One of the early, I don't know if it's fictitious stories about the death of surfing in Hawaii was that the missionaries planted keawe trees, which have these long thorns all along the coast. So to discourage people from going out there barefoot, much less in any other condition.
Interesting.
Is that fact or fiction? Or?
The missionaries were not responsible for that. I think that's all folklore. The actual reason for the surfing was economical, as I said, and it was essentially that prior to the colonists that had come in, before industry had come in, they had a pretty easygoing lifestyle. I mean, they were fishing, gathering the native fruits and whatever they ate, and it was and they were surfing and doing all kinds of other things. I mean, I literally rewrote the history of surfing in Hawaii in its relationship to the culture. The myth of surfing today is that that's all they did was surf in Hawaii. Not true. Surfing was just one little part of lots of other things that they did, and I chronicle those things in the book. The true reason was they became the workforce for the colonists. And so with the plantations developing, and there was a tree, I'm trying to remember the name of the tree, that they were literally deforesting the islands. Sandalwood. The sandalwood, they came in with ships and so forth and hauled this off, and they were the workforce. So now they were working long hours, probably 6-7 days a week. It left little time for surfing. So that's why surfing kind of disappeared. Until the late 1800s, when the tourist industry started again. And when we started sending people over on steamer ships from Long Beach, the Lure Line. How many of you know the Lure Line?
My grandmother went on there.
Pardon me?
My grandmother went on
Yeah. Yeah, Whitey Harrison and an old famous surfer named Pete Peterson actually stowed away on the Lure Line and went over to Hawaii, and they were going over learning to surf, bringing back Hawaiian surf culture back to San Onofre. And so yeah, that's all part of the culture. Any other questions? Yes.
When did the shortboard revolution begin?
70s. Yeah, 70s. And that basically put a lot of the old longboard, traditional longboard shapers out of business. Dale Velsey is a good example. Dale's, his business dropped off, but at the same time, Dale was, shall we say, not too financially responsible. And the feds came in and raided him and took everything away from him for not paying his taxes. And he got so fed up, he went back to Arizona to become a cowboy. And he was a working cowboy until a few years later when there was a resurgence of the longboards. And all of a sudden, boy, the last decades of his life, he was making, he would do these beautiful wooden boards and sell them for $10,000 plus. I became friends with Dale. Actually, I met him as a cowboy. I didn't know who he was. I was at a cowboy event doing a book signing for a book on Western movies that I wrote, and I talked to him for 2 mornings. He was dressed like an old saddle bum. And after 2 mornings of talking cowboy stories with him, another buddy of mine who turned out to be another one of those original longboard cowboys, he's a world famous bit maker, a fellow named Bruce Hayner, he says, "Do you know who you've been talking to the last 2 mornings?" He says, "That's Dale Velzy." I go, "You got to be kidding me." And so I said, he's a cowboy. So I met him as a cowboy before I ever knew him as a surfer. And then I became friends with Fran, his common-law wife. She's still around, and she's living over in San Clemente. And she supplied a number of photographs for me from the book. Dale had died before I even started the project, so I missed him. So yeah, the longboard. The other one that was a guy that got out of the business was another one of our pioneers that just died in recent months, and I'm going to go blank on his name. Who's the big fella that was living up in Crescent City?
Oh, yeah, I know you.
A surf filmmaker. He was one of the early surf filmmakers. Help me, some of the surfers in the room.
There's a picture of him standing in front of a huge wave on the shore in Hawaii.
The Bull.
Yes.
That was his nickname.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Anyhow, he just passed not too long ago. He had to quit making surfboards, and he went to work as a professional fisherman up in Oregon, I think, if I remember right, Northern California, Oregon. He died in Crescent City. But he was back shaping boards in the last days of his life. Greg Knoll. Yeah. Greg Knoll. Yeah.
This isn't a question, but I saw on TV something that I think it's UCSD is offering a class in shaping.
Could be.
It's one of the SoCal. I don't think it's Santa Barbara. I think it was San Diego.
The year before COVID, San Diego State hosted an international surfing conference. And they invited professors from all over the world who study surf science and surf culture. I was invited to speak on surf culture. It was a 4-day event. It was marvelous. And I met 2 of the professors. I think probably the place you're talking about is Cal State San Marcos.
Mm-hmm.
No?
It was at UC.
It was a UC. Okay, then I don't know about that.
I think it's San Diego.
Cal State San Marcos has a surfing science program where they did some of the early research. I mention it in the book. Did some of the early research on geriatric surfing as well. But they have a surfing. They have a surfing treadmill. At any given day at San Onofre, you will see 4 generations of surfers in the water. You'll see surfers as young as 6 years old, and you'll see surfers that are in their early 80s, and everything in between. Yeah, it's a very remarkable culture there, unlike anything you'll find anywhere in the world, really. Question?
On Camp Pendleton, there's a building called the Officers Club.
Yes.
San Onofre Creek, I think, and it's just a little bit upstream from that.
It's just downstream from San Onofre Creek.
Oh, yeah, the building
Yep.
isn't, from the picture, it's just upstream.
Yep. Yeah, I have a whole section in the book.
Yeah,
About-
I surfed there one time when I was about 14 years old.
Yeah.
Marines would capture your board and take it down to the farmhouse, and parents would have to go get it.
To the provost marshal.
Didn't happen to me,
Yeah. Well, before we get to that, let me just mention the building itself. The building itself was made by a very famous architect, designed. He's the same one that designed the Rose Bowl. And the Huntington, I think the Huntington Library was the other one. I'm not positive. I think that's the other one. I have a whole story of that building in the book, and pictures from inside it. The farm community, the farm workers community and so forth, held their Christmas parties in that building. So I have pictures of it there. And there were schoolhouses at San Onofre. I mean, they had everything there. It was a very interesting farm culture that was largely due to Norm Haven's father, Archibald. He built the school. Excuse me, talking all day. He built the school. He built. I mean, he was light years ahead of the best farm conditions. Norm hosted a farm workers reunion for years and years and years. I think it was a Christmas party kind of deal. And it was amazing how many of them showed up. And they were mostly Hispanic and Japanese. I interviewed some of the Japanese farmers for the book. Interesting part of the history was one of the farmers from San Onofre actually had a case go to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was all based on the, how many of you are familiar with the Alien Land Act or Alien Land Law? It was the law that said that an Asian could not own land in California. And so when a farmer from San Onofre wanted to buy a plot down in Carlsbad, he said, okay, I'll put the property in my son's name, who was 5 years old at the time. He was American born. And San Diego County said, no, you can't do that. You're doing an end run around the law. And they took the property away from him. And he took the case all the way to the Supreme Court and won, and completely overturned that law. So there's another significant part of the history there. In regards to to answer your question, in regards to the stories about the Marines, yeah, that whole area there was off limits, and the MPs, I had dozens and dozens of stories about the surfers being chased by the MPs, even shot at by the MPs out in the water. They weren't trying to hit them, they were trying to scare them to bring them out of the water. And after hearing dozens of those stories, I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to hear the other side of the story? So I put a notification in Leatherneck Magazine, which is a worldwide magazine for the Marine Corps. And all I said was, if you were an MP at San Onofre between 1942, when they started the base, and 1972, when they stopped enforcing that, please contact me. And I got 6 responses. So I have pictures of the MPs and their side of the story of taking the surfboards away from them. And in some cases, they were pretty brutal, slashing tires, running over the surfboards with their trucks and so forth. It was pretty interesting.
I hate to bring this to a close, but we're not really. We're just going downstairs, and we want you to have some Thanksgiving cheer. And we have drinks and refreshments. So, and of course, you'll be able to talk to David down there. And he's signing his book. Yeah,
if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book today, I've got books with me, and you can get an autographed copy of the book tonight and take it home with you.
And somebody in here has a story. Robbie, what did you pay for his?
I looked it up last night. I paid $103. I thought my nephew-in-law, who is an avid surfer, he surfed that area. I paid $103 last year at Christmas at Hobie's to buy your book.
So if that was last year, that's a second edition, I think. That's the book that I have. That's the book that I have here. Yeah, that retails for $80. I had been.
Discount tonight, right?
Yeah. You actually do. I'm going to pay the sales tax tonight, so you can go out the door for $80 even.
It's going to cost you $80
yeah,
tonight.
Yeah. I had heard stories that original $60 book, that they were selling them for $120.
I thought I was.
And they sold them out at $120.
Yeah, I thought I wasn't sure whether it was 130 or 103.
Yeah. I heard that from people who work there, actually.
Well, please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you.
Today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.